Hey everybody! Today Rahdo runs once again through his top 10 fantasy games list. Oh yeah, I'm returning to one of my favorite topics of all time because it was 5 years ago this month that I did my first top 10 ever on the channel. And it was for fantasy because I love fantasy, and more to the point, I should say, I love meat and potatoes fantasy. I love my Gygax and my Tolkien. I love dungeon delving and dragons and goblins and orcs and all the rest of it. So, 5 years ago I made that list and we're going to do it again, and oh my gosh, it's changed. Only two of the games that were on my list 5 years ago are still on this list today. And I think that's actually a great thing because it goes to show just how much of an explosion of really cool Euro-style fantasy games have come out over the years. When I made this list a while ago, it was kind of tough to actually come up with 10 games that I love to pieces. I mean, they were all games I really enjoyed, but now the list I've got, it is, it's just gone to 11 in terms of just how much I enjoy these games. So, if you want to check out my original top 10, you can, hit that eye up in the top right corner screen. Look at me. Look at how much younger and tanner I was back when I lived in Malta. But anyway, if you want to go check that out, you can hit the eye in the top right corner of the screen and all of that. Or if you're ready, you just want to hear, hey, tell me the new list. The new list? Well, let's start. Let's start with number 10. Tiny Epic Defenders. Oh, this is such a great little cooperative adventure, and I don't think enough people really pick up on this. To me, this is very much a fantasy implementation of some of the core ideas of Pandemic, which it really comes down to the fact that the whole cooperative game where players are little tiny heroes running around a tiny world but having epic adventures trying to save it from a non-stop onslaught of bad guys. But the whole game is driven by this single deck of cards. And in this deck of cards are cards that let players take their turn but also let the bad guys take their turn. And what happens is, over the course of a play session of Tiny Epic Defenders, the deck gets built bigger and bigger and bigger with more and more bad guys. So at the beginning of the game, we're super strong. I mean, we're able to take care of everything. But over the course of the game, as the deck gets built and seeded with more terror and danger and all of that, the tougher things get. But on the flip side, the more knowledge we have as players, because we know now in the deck there's a Kraken. The Kraken hasn't come out this run through the deck yet. Somebody's got to get over there because he's going to show up eventually. Do we press our luck and hopefully we get one more turn before he gets there? These are the same kind of decisions that you find yourself making when you're playing Pandemic after you take the virus deck and shuffle it up and put it back on top. And all of a sudden now you have imperfect information about what's coming. That's what makes Tiny Epic Defenders so much fun. It's just such a sharp, great game. And I should say, it was always a good game, but now it has gotten a new re-release, a second edition with completely redone art, a lot of redone monsters and bosses and stuff like that, and a really awesome expansion as well, the Dark War, that adds so much to it. I mean, with all this stuff, there's no way it couldn't make it on the list. Maybe if it were just talking straight Tiny Epic, it wouldn't have made my top 10, but with the new second edition and Dark War, wow. This game, I mean, it's just become all the more epic while still staying fairly tiny. And that's why it's my number 10, Tiny Epic Defenders. And then we've got number 9, Dragonfire. Now, this is actually a sequel to my number 2 game of all time, I think. Either my number 2 or my number 3, Shadowrun Crossfire. It's a cooperative deck builder. In fact, a lot of these are going to be cooperative, I think. Actually, no, that's not true. Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of competitive here. Don't worry, co-op haters. We'll have some competition soon. But anyway, Dragonfire, like Shadowrun Crossfire before it, is a cooperative deck builder where players are going on a series of adventures, and these adventures, for the most part, take the form of a deck of, again, event cards that keep getting drawn and keep throwing just the nastiest, nastiest stuff at you. And players have to build their decks as fast as possible to get as strong as possible to try to basically just stay alive, to make it through this kind of grueling marathon. Although it's a quick marathon. I mean, Jen, we generally play a game in 20-25 minutes. I really like it a lot. And you might be saying, wait a minute, didn't you just say the prequel to this, Shadowrun Crossfire, which is kind of a quasi-fantasy game, but it's set in a sci-fi, cyberpunk, fantasy, mishmash universe. So Shadowrun Crossfire does not make my list because this is a list of meat and potatoes, Dungeons and Dragons, Tolkien-inspired type stuff. Shadowrun Crossfire is, I think, it didn't quite fit that. But Dragonfire does, and I love it a lot. It's in my top 10, but it's nowhere near the top like Shadowrun Crossfire would be. I talked about why when I did my run-through final thoughts. So I still really like it, but still, Shadowrun Crossfire is the better game, but it doesn't mean Dragonfire isn't a phenomenal experience too, and I absolutely love it, and that's why it's number 9, Dragonfire. Then we've got number 8, Catacombs. Okay, we're done with the co-op for a while, folks. Let's get some competitive stuff in this fantasy disc flicking game, where one player is effectively a dungeon master out to destroy the heroes any way he can, because that's how he wins. And I think it's up to 4 players can control a group of heroes. And the whole game is played out over a series of dungeon boards where players flick their little discs that represent their characters, or little additional discs that like represent arrows that they shoot, or spells, or what have you, and they just try to maneuver around obstacles and whatnot, and the heroes are trying to survive through a series of levels of the dungeon. The dungeon master, or whatever they're called, is basically trying to take them out through attrition, because the heroes are infinitely more powerful than the monsters, but there are a lot of monsters in this game. So many cool discs. The art is absolutely phenomenal from Kwanchai Moria, I believe, is most beautiful game to date, and it's just a blast. If you want to go watch my original run-through of it, you can find I played it with Jen, and I think it really shows just how much fun this game can be. It's interesting, Jen and I, we generally do not go for games where players are directly attacking each other, and that's true in the fantasy realm as well, even though there are so many great fantasy combat games, say Magic the Gathering. But this is one where we'll make an exception because it's so much fun. And I think in part we make the exception too because I always have to play the evil dungeon master. I always have to play the villain. And it's interesting. It doesn't feel so bad when I'm actually a villain trying to take out Jen. And it doesn't feel so, she doesn't feel so bad when she takes out my evil minions because we kind of get caught up in the story. I have to admit, even though I'm always evil, I'm always rooting for the heroes to win. Not that I'm saying I throw the game, but I don't know. It's something about the role-playing aspect of this, that one player is good and one player is evil, but we're both there to have fun, that really makes Catacombs very special. And it's just fun dick flicking as well. But now, let's move on to number 7, the beautiful, wonderful Ryan Lockett masterpiece, Near and Far. And some people who know the game, they might say, hey, wait a minute, is that really what you would call meat and fantasy potatoes? No, meat and potato fantasy. Not meat and fantasy. I've been off the air for a while, folks. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to get back into my groove here. Anyway, I think so. It does have enough fantasy, fantastical elements, interesting creatures that you run afoul of, and, exciting moments, and, magic and all of that. Maybe it's right on the hairy edge as to being something other than bog standard fantasy, but it was close enough to me and I absolutely adore it. This is another competitive game where players are effectively racing to score as many points as possible through a variety of mechanisms. Improving your character, making cool items, but the most important way is by completing story quests that all come from a big gigantic book of beautifully, wonderfully written narrative encounters that you go on throughout the game. And the interesting thing is, this has an epic campaign mode, much like, I should have mentioned, Dragonfire also has a great campaign mode. It's one of the other reasons we like it, because we're playing through this big epic campaign that's going to take us through multiple years of play. But anyway, Near and Far has a campaign mode where in the original book, there are dozens of different campaigns you can play through, depending on whether you're playing through campaigns that reveal more and more of the world, or campaigns that reveal more and more of your characters. But whichever way you play, they're all full of wonderful, evocative storytelling. And as much as anything else, you're in a race to get to more of those really cool narrative storytelling moments in and amongst this really wonderful resource management Euro-style race game. It's phenomenal. It's beautiful. I've just gotten the expansion for it. Haven't gotten to try that yet, but man, I would rather be playing Near and Far right now than talking to you. I gotta be honest, folks. But let's continue on to number 6, Aeon's End. We're back to co-ops, folks. It's another co-op deck builder, and oh my gosh, this game is so brilliant, in part, interestingly, because it shares something with my number 10, Tiny Epic Defenders. Both of these games share this same concept with Pandemic, which is my favorite game of all time. The concept of a deck that is full of evil, terrible things that you are struggling and working together with your fellow players to try to overcome. But the thing is, you have imperfect information about that deck. And in fact, Aeon's End does it pretty much the exact same way as Tiny Epic Defenders. The deck has cards that let players take actions and has cards that lets the bad guys, the evil forces at work, take actions. And you never know who's going to get to go next. Am I going to go next? If you end up going next, it ruins everything. But, oh my gosh, if I'm next in the deck, then I can actually set you up so you can do the big thing and hit the ball. It's the beautiful purity of this simple system. It's wonderful in Tiny Epic Defenders. It's even better in Aeon's End because, well, Tiny Epic Defenders is kind of a light, fun, fast little tiny game with an epic feel. Aeon's End is a much more epic game to begin with. It takes longer. You really do a lot more deck building because, of course, players are building their own individual decks as well as having to deal with this evil deck that is being run through. It's absolutely phenomenal. And in fact, earlier this year, it went on Kickstarter with a new expansion that was a legacy version of the game. Jen and I played all the way through that, and oh my gosh, it's so great. We now have a version of Aeon's End with characters and cool, powered up cards that we can put in our decks that is unlike any other version of Aeon's End in the world because Jen and I built it together. That legacy element has really catapulted Aeon's End into the stratosphere, although there's still more to come. But that was my number 6, Aeon's End. Number 5, let's talk about Role Player. Oh my gosh, this is such a beautiful, brilliant puzzle of a fantasy game. And this is what I was talking about right up front, how there's just been this renaissance of Euro-themed fantasy games. 5 years ago, we were still coming off a Euro game? That should basically be set in Renaissance or medieval Europe and just be all about trying to run a city or build a castle or whatever. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I love that kind of stuff too. But over the years, as Euro-style gameplay mechanisms, economic, goods conversion games have become more and more popular, the subject matter has branched out. And Role Player is a perfect example of that because it is a high fantasy game where each player is competing to literally roll up the best fantasy character they can. Think trying to make you a Dungeons and Dragons character, worrying about your strength, your constitution, your intelligence, your dexterity, your wisdom, and your charisma. I think. Did I get that right? Hopefully. But that's the core conceit of the game. But we do this through a brilliant dice drafting mechanism that is so tense and so cool. I absolutely love it. Because once we're drafting those dice, we have to slot them into the perfect slot, and there are so many things to take into consideration. Like I said, it's a gorgeous, brilliant clockwork puzzle of a game, and it just blows our minds. We love it every time we play, and I'm looking forward. It had one expansion so far, which we thought was okay, but I wasn't quite happy about everything they introduced, but I'm really excited about the next expansion. Or actually, no, I'm sorry, it's not the next expansion. There's going to be a sequel to this where after you have played Role Player and developed your characters, you can then take those characters into this other game and use them in adventures. So it's kind of like a little mini campaign. I'm so excited about that too. Anyway, I think Role Player has a gorgeous, wonderful, brilliant future, and that's why it's my number 5, Role Player. And now on to number 4, Forge War. Forge War is probably the biggest, heaviest, most complex, and longest playing game that I own in my collection. And that's saying something because generally speaking, Jen and I, we kind of tend towards the hour to hour and a half long games, but Forge War, it's a 2-3 hour big epic, again, Euro-style simulation. This is another one of these games where I'm talking about where, instead of building, a castle for the King of France, we are, local merchants in a fantasy universe trying to mine for ore we need to, craft weapons to outfit adventurers with the best stuff they can so that they can go off and fight in adventures. I love that. I love that kind of twist on its head, the notion of, no, we're not the heroes. We're the guys and girls behind the heroes who make it possible for them to do. So we're the real heroes of this thing, because if we didn't get all this stuff made and pay these heroes to go save the town would be ruined. So where's our glory? Well, this is when the middle managers of the world get to be the heroes of the game. And it's a blast. Even though it's so long, Jen and I love it to pieces. And it's interesting too because it combines like 3 completely different games, all squashed into one big, sprawling, epic, sloppy mess of a game that is just a blast to play. It is so epic thematic. It's got, like I said, the resource gathering thing, which is kind of, I guess it's inspired by Yinch, which is an abstract game I've never played. Then it's got a worker placement game, which is where you take those resources and build the stuff. And then it's got this resource management, almost kind of push your luck game a little bit, where you control the adventurers as they go further and further and work harder and harder to complete more and more of the quest to score you more and more points. It's a lovely, brilliant, incredible game from designer Isaac Childress, who is probably the hottest designer in the industry right now because he's put out Gloomhaven. And so I think Forge War, is kind of his lesser child. I kind of wish he would re-release Forge War set in the Gloomhaven universe so that it could get a little bit more love because, man, I just adore it. That's why it's my number 4, Forge War. Then we've got number 3. Now, this is the first game that was on my list 5 years ago. What was it? The Kenner Spiel des Jahres, or was it just Spiel des Jahres winning Legends of Andor? Last time, it was my number 2. Now, it's my number 3, and I love it just as much as I did back then. A wonderful, again, very puzzly fantasy game where we are on, high fantasy adventures, traveling all around the land, trying to fight off monsters that are trying to overrun the castle, complete quests, and, have these big epic adventures. All that kind of stuff is pretty standard, again, meat and potatoes fantasy. But what makes this game so special and so unique is the puzzly nature of the way the bad guys advance. After players get to do their stuff, the bad guys advance, and the board is a brilliant design in terms of graphic design, although there were some mistakes made. Actually, I talked about this board in my top 10 graphic design I did a couple months ago. But anyway, the way it works, the bad guys can kind of hopscotch and leapfrog over each other. So if you are not surgically precise in your strikes of which monsters you take out, because you can figure it all out, you can see exactly how all the monsters are going to move and how they're going to interact and how they're going to completely destroy you. And so you have to target the right keys, the right chains in the link to take out them so that you can basically do this big crowd control puzzle. And I love that. And you might think, well, why don't I just kill everybody? That's the other thing I love about this game, although a lot of people hate it. The more you kill the monsters, the quicker the doomsday clock gets to running out. And so, again, you just can't afford to fight everybody. Fights are few and far between. And when you have them, they are uber important because you can't afford to mess up. That's what creates this amazing tension in this wonderful cooperative game that has gotten so much expansion content now over the years, ever since I did this 5 years ago. But man, it's still a blast. It's my number 3 now, Legends of Andor. But hey, let's talk about number 2, which was the only other game on my list all those years ago. Number 2 is Dungeon Petz, which used to be my number 1. And, Dungeon Petz is a precursor to what I'm talking about. Back, 5 years ago when, it was hard to find beautiful, densely, wonderfully atmospheric and thematic fantasy Euros, Dungeon Petz stood out from the crowd, which is why it was my number 1. But it's so good. The gameplay is so amazing and so funny. So brilliantly, often laugh out loud funny that it's still here, but it's my number 2. This is a game where we are families of imps who run basically fantasy pet shops trying to raise pets that dungeon masters will come and buy from us to populate their dungeons. And the thing is, this is a game where you raise these pets from babies, and you have to pay attention to their every need, feeding them and playing with them and cleaning up their messes and all, and helping them when they're sick and they got the sniffles and all that. The art is adorable, but the gameplay is tense and dense. This is a complex game. This is probably the second deepest game or heaviest game after Forge War on this list. I mean, don't go into thinking, oh my god, this is going to be a really cool fantasy Tamagotchi experience. It's not that. This is a gamer's game. It's a longer game. It's a very deep, rich, tense worker placement game. And hey, it was my number 1 5 years ago. It's still my number 2. It's still that good. From Vlaada Chvátil, I think it is his masterpiece, even though some people might say Codenames or Through the Ages. But for me, Dungeon Petz is where it's at. But hey, folks, there's a new number 1. And you probably already guessed what it is, because I've already mentioned it. That's right, my number 1 fantasy game of all time now is the beautiful, the awe-inspiring, the wonderful, wonderful Gloomhaven. Which, it should be no surprise, right? It's literally the #1 highest ranked game on Board Game Geek. By that metric, it is the greatest board game in the world! And it almost is. It's actually, right now, it is my #3 highest ranked game of all time, behind Pandemic and Shadowrun Crossfire. And Gloomhaven is my #3. It could easily be my #2 if there was a couple little things that bug me in the design that keep it, because it is a big, monstrous beast of a game, make no mistake. Hugely complex, a million little rules. I would have loved to see it streamlined down a little more, but on the flip side, I don't want to, because I love it for everything it does, including the stuff I don't like. Like the Crag Hearts and their stupid rules for blazing. Oh, I'm sorry. Not going to go down that route. I've complained about it plenty on Board Game Geek, but in spite of those things, hey, you know what? It's because I love the game so much that those little niggly things drive me nuts. But there's a good reason this game is #1 on Board Game Geek, and for me, #3 of all time. And hey, it's my #1 fantasy game. It is deep, it is rich, it is fulfilling. When you buy this game, it's an expensive game, but you know, this is a, what do you call it? Yeah, they used to call, I'm trying to think, called Magic the Gathering a lifestyle game? Yeah, a lifestyle game, because once you've got it, you could be playing that box for years. So many characters, so many discoveries, and so much replayability. Even if you make it all the way through the epic campaign, which is probably going to take you 50 to 100 hours, even if you do that. The game comes with really great tools for randomly generated adventures you can continue to play, because at its heart, it is a dungeon crawl that is driven by cards. You have a very small deck of cards that determines everything you can do. These cards are multi-use. Every turn, it is agonizing to try to figure out, should I use this card for this function or this function? Should I use this card? Should I jettison this card? It's brilliant. It's my #1 fantasy game, my #3 game of all time, Gloomhaven. And that's it, folks. We're done. Will I see you again in 5 years? Will this list have changed as radically? I don't know, but it was certainly fun to revisit this and just reflect on just how far we've come in just 5 short years. It is a great, great time to be a Euro fan. Because, yeah, I mean, it's not just fantasy games. There's so many wonderful sci-fi Euros and, you know, weird, offbeats and Euros set in the modern world, and it's so great. Don't get me wrong. Again, I loves me my old classic, dry, boring Euros, your Lorenzo El Magnificos and all that stuff. But I love variety, and I love fantasy. I love meat and potatoes fantasy, and so these are 10 games that I cannot recommend highly enough. And that's it, folks. Thanks very much for watching. Have a very, very nice day. Talk to you later. So long. Bye-bye.